Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I've Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio.
And y'all, we are so excited to welcome back. All right, I'm going to have to list these off, and I know I'm going to miss some. Award-winning activist, writer, journalist, podcaster, one of Time's Women of the Year, and friend of the show, obviously, Raquel Willis. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me on. It's good to be back.
Congrats on the well-deserved, hard-earned title of all the things, but including Time's Women of the Year. Hello.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a wild year. So it's actually interesting because they named me one of Time's Women of the Year. And then like a few weeks later, we're like, we also want to name me to the Time 100. And I was like, okay, sure. Let's just get it all out of the way this year and leave nothing for the rest of my life.
Nothing for the rest of my life. I know, honestly, like, just the fact that I'm much older than you and you have all of these accolades, I'm like, I'm really behind. But also, I love being able to say, I know her. So, you know, it feels like I won just by being able to do that. So thank you for letting me do that as well.
Well, thank you. I mean, you know, these honors are great and amazing, and I know they add a lot of shine, but, you know, they can never capture all of the work that's happening, right? So Samantha, like, we're going to reframe this and just say they just got like a little snippet of amazing folks out there and they're coming back for you.
Oh, okay. I'm going to take that in. But just know, yes, I'm really glad to see that you are getting the flowers while you can, because I know as part of your journey in podcasting, as well as obviously journalism, is to talk about those who didn't get the flowers when they were alive. And you've been a very, very busy woman. So thank you once again for coming on to our show, our little tiny show. We're so excited to have you back on. But just in case we have some new listeners, can you tell them a bit about yourself?
Sure. Can I also say, I'm thinking, and I think I've been on Stuff Mom Never Told You like more than maybe any other podcast, because this is like maybe my third or fourth time being on since every kind of iteration of it. So shout out to y'all for loving on your girl and bringing her on. But yeah, so I'm Raquel Willis. I am all of the things that Samantha just said, writer, activist, a bunch of things. Much of my work focuses on Black trans power and liberation. And I know some folks are like, oh, okay, well, maybe this has nothing to do with me. But no, honey, it has everything to do with you, because I feel like all of our liberation is bound up in each other's. So, you know, through storytelling, through social justice and direct action, I'm always interested in how we can tell more nuanced, fuller stories of the lives of people on the margins.
And we absolutely love that and are happy to have you on anytime, Raquel. And the last time you were here, you were talking about your really amazing book. It's just absolutely fantastic. And your latest podcast, which you have a second season coming out now. So what can we expect in season 2?
Yeah, well, thank y'all again for having me on. When I was talking about my memoir, The Risk It Takes to Bloom, what a time that was, what a tour I had. But yeah, so we're back with season 2 of Afterlives. This series is really all about the lives and legacies of trans folks that we've lost too soon to so many different systems, so many different dynamics. The first season delved into the story of Layleen Polanco. So she was a 27-year-old trans Afro-Latina who died in Rikers custody. And we told her story through the movements that she inspired. She was a part of ballroom culture. She was someone who inspired, after her death, the fight for ending solitary confinement in New York, decriminalizing sex work, and so much more. And so the second season, we were like, okay, how can we go bigger? And we went about as big as you can go in wanting to delve into the life of Marsha P. Johnson. So if you don't know who Marsha P. Johnson is, well, we're going to get you caught up. She is a movement foremother for the LGBTQ plus movement. There are a lot of myths and legends about her that she was on the ground the nights of the Stonewall riots and that she threw the first brick. And so there's actually an episode this season where we kind of unpack that. What's true? What's real? But we also wanted to get into her humanity. And I know this very well now. I mean, we were just talking about these time honors, but I think there's a way that when we start putting people on a pedestal, we start throwing out these terms like legend and iconic. In some way, we kind of strip them of their complexity or of their humanity. Like we forget that, no, they're just living and breathing and messy and having, all types of love and romantic experiences. And so that was kind of the humanity we wanted to bring back to Marsha. And I'm so excited for folks to hear this season.
When I was listening to the first episode, that was something that you did talk about a lot. It's about having to bring back the humanity, to see her struggle, to see the beauty in her struggle, as well as the beauty in her legend and the things that she did in her activism. And you did a great job in narrating her story in such an empathetic and again, human way. Why do you think this is so important when it comes to talking about, as I would say, iconic and legendary person as Marsha?
I think it's important because we get a different kind of lesson when we give that humanity back. When we put people on these pedestals, I think it can kind of detach us in a way where we're like, okay, well, what is my part in all of this? Because I'm never going to live up to that. And it's like, that's not actually what it's about. It's actually about us giving ourselves grace for our humanity, for the mistakes we may have made, and also understanding that we can have major impact simply by living in authenticity. And that's one thing that I hope we really kind of drive home for folks in an effective way with this season. I love the parts of Marsha's story that I didn't know, right? Like I didn't know much about her family life growing up, that she was always kind of this eccentric character, that she always had a love of performance. We got to talk to her sister, Jeannie, and her nephew, Al, who she babysat when he was a kid, which is like, you got babysat by Marsha P. Johnson. And there's this beautiful story that they tell about her being a part of this choir. I won't give all the details, but that she was never a great singer, but somehow in her charisma, her offbeat singing made people really feel a sense of warmth and love from her. And so I just love like those little anecdotes that she was always kind of marching to the beat of her own drum, and somehow that brought people in.
Right. And I think there's something that we don't talk enough about, especially when it comes to activists and people who really were the beginning of movements, is the mental health capacity. And some of the struggles, which you hit at very beginning. You were like, okay, we can't talk about this without acknowledging she had some struggles when it came to mental health, and they're not shameful, but she was never necessarily ashamed of it either. She just said, this is what it is. Why? I go back and forth because there's so much need in trying to open up that level of conversations that we're not demonizing this. At the same time, we're also not using this as an excuse. And I feel like you're opening this dialogue up in an amazing way. What can we expect in this level of understanding when it comes to talking about mental health, especially with Marsha?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the beautiful things that we get to do in this time is that we can look back at, say, someone like Marsha who died over 30 years ago now, and look at other elements of their life and be able to maybe understand them in ways that people at the time couldn't. And so we've had a whole revolution in talking about mental health in the last at least decade that I think really is beneficial, because we can look at Marsha, who was someone who had moments that she considered to be breakdowns. She had moments where she was institutionalized due to her mental health struggles. And there was never any kind of official diagnosis or anything, which I also think is beautiful too, because sometimes we don't have to have that kind of perfect label for it. We can just understand that the difficulties of life really can make it impossible for everything to be perfect and flawless and smooth. And that's okay. And even though she had these moments with difficulties around mental health, she still had a commitment to making the world better, to being a beacon and a pillar of her community. She was still committed to being an artist. I mean, she was a person who performed on stage. I didn't know before we worked on the series that she went to perform out in London, right? So like, she wasn't just performing here in the States, but like, she got to travel internationally. And so that also just kind of added more of a dimension to the impact that she had and the large life that she lived.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that she went international either. Like, it feels like a whole different... I wonder, are you going to be tackling those specific performances outside of the U.S. or?
We will, yes.
Okay.
We have some great deep dives there. I mean, honestly, hopefully my production team isn't like, girl, you're giving away too much. But
that's a hint. We got to get some hints while you're here.
I think that that's just a beautiful thing for folks to know, that Marsha did travel. She did have stints in places outside of New York. She was born in New Jersey, right? So she wasn't initially a New Yorker. She kind of became a New Yorker, which I think is kind of that quintessential story. Is like, you leave home for a lot of folks and go to a big city, not even just New York. We talk about Atlanta so much because that's so near and dear to our hearts, and y'all are based there. But leaving and going to that big city and trying to figure out who you are in a different context, like, that was also a part of Marsha's story too.
Yeah, I love that. And just kind of like going on with the first episode of the podcast, you say something that feels like it's both obvious, but also not said enough or untold, that trans people have always been here. And I think that statement is both small but huge. And it just feels like, with the things we learn about Marsha, because again, she kind of has been put in a box. Like, I knew her as, and it was recently, like you were talking about, you didn't know a lot of history until you got to college, or for me, honestly, it was as I was trying to become a podcaster in this specific field, intersectional feminism, that I was figuring out all of these historical figures, such as Marsha. And I was like, oh, wow. So let's talk about Stonewall, because I knew of it, but didn't know much of it. But when it comes to things like this, talking about trans people have always been here, what makes this statement so important and relevant today?
Yeah, well, I want to hone in on what you shared. I mean, I am the first to tell folks, like, I didn't know so much about trans experience, until I was in the thick of it, honey. And I think that that's true for a lot of us, right? It's not until you have these moments in life that kind of push you to expand more, to learn more, to seek out information, to make sense of what you're absorbing. And I grew up in small town Augusta, Georgia, so I was also in this context in the late 90s, early 2000s, where it was still very taboo to talk about any type of queerness. I grew up very Catholic and religious. And so I definitely was not getting maybe the education I needed around who I was going to be in the world. And I think Marsha and the history that's kind of attached to her, like the Stonewall riots, this kind of history of queer resistance and activism, was like a balm for me, for someone who felt so different, so othered for so long. It felt in a way like coming home spiritually to this person that now I consider one of my chosen ancestors. So I think that it was really important to be candid about that there's always an opportunity for us to learn. You don't have to feel like you're late to the ball game, I guess. And also in this time, it's important for us to be clear that trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary folks have always been here. You know, we're facing a moment where we have this authoritarian figure and this regime back in power. And Trump is really pushing this idea that trans people and intersex people and anybody with kind of a more marginalized experience, that we don't exist. You know, we're facing attacks on all sides, whether it's queer and trans people facing restrictions around access to healthcare, or it's these DEI discussions, right, where they're trying to strip not just queer and trans people, but folks of color and women from their rightful positions in their professions and in their careers. So it's important for us to tell the truth about these marginalized experiences in this time, because that's a part of our radical defiance, right? We have to defy this idea that we don't exist. And I think as a trans person, I just want to be a bridge. You know, I know that there are a lot of young trans people out there who are seeing these attacks and wondering, well, what does this mean for them? But they need to know that there were folks that were fighting in even grislier and more difficult times, who were fighting in advance for them, who were loving them in advance. And I just want to use my work to be a bridge so that they know that there are footsteps that we can walk in.
That's beautiful. I'm gonna need that quilted somewhere, because I need to write that down before I forget, because that's such an amazing concept, and especially with the work that you do, with the work that you've been doing, and as loud as you have been for this type of advocacy, which I feel like is what makes people like you and Marsha so iconic. I'm going to use that term in that, because there is willingness to be that example. And that's such a tough role to play in general. And especially today, as we are navigating such interesting spaces with like social media and the internet and AI and all of that. Like it feels so much bigger, and so sometimes harder to try to dispel some of the misinformation and misrepresentation that's out there. So yeah, first of all, thank you. And I love looking up to you, even though I'm so much older than you. I'm like, I want to be like her when I grow up.
So much older.
I am so much older, and I feel it today, especially. But
you know,
things, though.
But that's one of the beautiful things, I think, especially in like queer and trans community, is that, you know, age is a little different for us, because people come into their identities at different points in life, which means they come into different information and understandings of the world at different points in their lives, right? I mean, I have people, you know, who are elders who are like thanking me. And I'm like, no, thank you. Because I wouldn't be able to do what I do without the blocks of the foundation that you put down for me.
I think it's interesting because as many cyclical things that as we have seen, it feels so disappointing, especially again with this administration, because it's definitely cyclical. But seeing all of the people who are younger than me doing this significant work, feeling that hope, that this is the hope that I'm so glad that I continue to learn so much more through other people. And again, like the generations after me, and I'm learning from y'all. I'm like, yes, I need more of this. I've been missing out. And feeling, again, like even with all the darkest things that we see, feeling all the fear and seeing the protests and seeing all of the, you know, demonizing of just good people, to see the goodness in people who are fighting, that really does bring so much hope in this time. So yes, I'm gonna keep talking about how amazing I think you are, because I love it. But I also have to talk about the fact that you brought up something that made me laugh in that episode, because Anney and I have talked about this before, but you talked about your Tumblr that you wrote in college, which reminded me, because Anney and I have talked about this, I had an old Zynga. This is pre-Tumblr.
Oh, I had a Zynga.
Did you?
Yes.
What? I was going to ask.
I was in high school, or middle in high school. I had a Zynga though. Yeah.
I can't find mine. I think because it shut down. But anyway, it made me think of all the things that I had lost. And I'm like, oh my God, I kind of wish I could be able to read it just to be embarrassed of myself. But I had to ask, what made you think of these old posts, and why did you want to share it with listeners? And I'm really glad you did, by the way.
Well, I have to give so much love to our production team. I mean, Dylan Hoyer, Joey Pat, Julia Furlon, and so many others. Really, this season wanted to use this as an opportunity to kind of get more meta and get more into the process of what it is like for me to revisit these stories, and particularly the story of someone I consider to be a North Star like Marsha. And so as we were kind of planning the season, one of the questions they had for me, because they kind of had to interview me so that we could put more of myself into the narrative, was, when did you first hear about Marsha? And I kind of talked about the impact of the internet, and thinking about, well, I probably read about her first on like a Wikipedia page in like the late 2000s. But it probably really wasn't until I made it to college, was studying, I was in women's studies classes, meeting queer and trans community in a real way for the first time. And we were all connecting on Tumblr. And Tumblr was like that era where people would throw out social justice warrior as like a slur, right? So like, for those of us who were in our feminist bag before it really kind of hit the mainstream in a bigger way, it was the trenches out here. Yes. There are all of these horrible narratives, like calling feminists all like lesbians as pejorative, or saying that we weren't attractive, or or we were completely man-hating in a particular way. Like it was just really grisly and gnarly at that time. But Tumblr was really one of the few safe spaces, I guess you could say, on the internet where we could gather, we could be our wannabe woke selves as much as we wanted to. And we could learn, like you could literally learn theory. So now we have like TikTok, where people are doing, these TikTok universities and, these series where they're educating folks. But a lot of that, for the first time in a major way, was happening on Tumblr, I contend.
Oh, I never did get into the Tumblr. Like, I think I got, like I said, Zynga was my thing. And then I did a little bit of MySpace, and that was about the end.
Yeah. Well, Tumblr was also the platform that really allowed you to do multiple things at once with media, right? Yeah. So it was kind of like IG and Facebook and the platform formerly known as Twitter.
Yes.
All in one. So you could kind of do different types of microblogging, which was cool.
Yes.
Now, all of these other platforms have kind of bitten off of that idea, and, IG has threads now, and Twitter has more capabilities with media. But like at the time, it was really Tumblr that was letting you do it all in one place.
Was it pre-Reddit? That's just a technical.
No,
Reddit was out?
Reddit's been around longer than Tumblr.
Oh, really? Anney? Can you confirm?
But I'm not sure, actually. I can't remember when Reddit got on my radar.
I don't know.
I kind of want to say Reddit has been around at least since the MySpace days. And maybe it just wasn't as big.
Okay. Someone will have to look into this later.
We did do an episode on Reddit, so we should know this. But
I don't think we did a timeline in like
I think we
social
did.
media. Did we?
Did you?
That was compartmentalized to that episode, and I've forgotten it completely.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
I just did a quick Google.
All right. Tell
Because
us
we
what the
are
Google
virtual
say.
right now. And
That's
it's
true.
saying it was founded in 2005. So, but you know what? I will say, I don't think Reddit was as big as like, remember when there was like Yahoo Answers?
Yes.
Like that
Ask
was
Jeeves.
like, and Ask Jeeves, like those were big. And then I feel like Yahoo just like fell off a cliff.
Oh yeah.
And
For
then I
sure.
guess Reddit came in and took that space.
Okay. I feel like I'm aging myself in this conversation as well, so I'm gonna stop this. Stop this right now.
No, you're good. But you know, it was fun going back through my Tumblr and kind of seeing in real time my embrace of my trans identity.
Yeah.
So I kind of read off some posts where I'm talking about I just came out to like my mom and like all of these things and also figuring out, well, what is my connection to Black trans history and figures like Marsha in real time? So like you were saying, you wish you had your Zanga, like Tumblr isn't so far back that I don't have it. Like I never completely deleted it. I just kind of locked it down.
I'm grateful that you didn't delete it because hearing you read off those posts were amazing. And I was like, yes, I remember this. Like ideal, like when you go back to seeing what you wrote and you're like, what? But at the same time, yes, that was really profound.
Yeah.
Give yourself credit. Well, if you could, what is something you would tell that Tumblr writing baby self today?
What would I tell myself? You know, I look back and sometimes I'm like, do I get less fearless the older I get, or do I get more fearless? Because I just look back at moments and I'm like, girl, that was brave. I guess I would just encourage myself. I would just be like, keep going, listen to that inner voice. It's not going to steer you wrong. And that's kind of what I would tell myself at various points throughout my life. It's like, just keep listening to your convictions, listening to your heart, because that's where your values are.
Well, going back to the podcast, as we've been talking about, you have some really amazing interviews and clips of Marsha, as well as amazing stories from friends of hers. What was the response from the people you worked with when you told them about this podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they were overwhelmingly excited for the opportunity to elevate Marsha's story, but also like in a format that allowed them to talk about the nuances. You know, Marsha had a very complex existence, which I think is true for a lot of trans folks, right? So, but especially in that time, the language was so different. You know, she used different identifiers at different points throughout her life. There were points where she was having a medical transition, and then there were points where she didn't have access to the medical part of her transition anymore. And so there are people who use more masculine pronouns for her. So that was interesting. But everyone called her Marsha. So, you know, there was kind of this understanding that it was clear she was moving through the world as Marsha. I think people's understanding of who she was really had to shift as society shifted. And so I think that that was an interesting dynamic in talking to friends and people who knew her during her lifetime, was that it didn't seem like she was a stickler about how they referred to her, except the name. So that was cool. I think folks also just wanted to be clear that, like, yes, Marsha has been fashioned into this icon, and in some ways she was a legend when she was alive, because people did know about her presence and action within the Stonewall riots. But she largely wasn't supported materially in that time. Like she dealt with a lot of barriers to housing at different points in her life, not including kind of her growing up with her origin family, and then kind of the last decade where she was roommates with her friend Randy Wicker. But she dealt with houselessness at various points. She engaged in sex work as a means of survival for large chunks of her life. So, it's interesting. And I think we kind of hold that tension of like, she was this very important and cherished figure. And also, there were just huge chunks of her life where her living conditions were precarious. And so how does that happen? And I think that we still see that today, right? Like I know plenty of particularly Black trans folks who are highly visible, but also are struggling with material conditions, because visibility doesn't necessarily mean vitality. It doesn't mean that your leadership may be respected, for instance, in the nonprofit space or even in the corporate space, right? So those things are interesting. But I love how we kind of thread those needles. I think we do a good job of kind of talking about that tension and that complexity.
Yes, absolutely. And I do love that. I love painting the full picture of someone that so many of us learn about in maybe just a snippet in a history book if we're lucky until we do get to college or something like that. And it is, I love that you're bringing in this sort of, she sings and it's not well, but she's very enthusiastic and that endears people to her. These facets of her.
Mm-hmm.
And you've already given us so much. We don't want to make your producers angry at you. But is there something else that you think you can tease that listeners might be surprised at and learning about this kind of legendary figure this season?
Well, one of the things that's really key in this story, and that was like a big goal for our production, was to tell essentially a Black trans history of the HIV/AIDS crisis in which Marsha lived through. And so I think that we get to do something unique, because when I think about the HIV/AIDS crisis, I didn't really have many stories of how trans people were impacted by it or survived it. Even of the elders that I do know now, many of them, their heyday was like really in the 90s, right? Or even the late 80s. And so you don't really get that glimpse into what it was like when the epidemic really kind of popped off in the early 80s. So I love that we get a chance to kind of add a new dimension to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And we get to talk about how Marsha continued to be a pillar of community in that time. She was losing friends left and right like everyone else. And we learned that she was a caretaker in that time. And so that's kind of this beautiful narrative that we get. And I also want to add that we get to have some really deep, robust interviews with Tourmaline, who is the official biographer of Marsha now. She just released the first definitive biography on Marsha called The Joy and Defiance of Marsha P. Johnson. And so we got to kind of lean on her scholarship in a beautiful way and also interview her a few times. So I'm so excited for us to kind of hear from Tourmaline about what the experience was like, kind of uncovering a lot of this.
Yes, that is so exciting. And that kind of relates to the next question. You've spoken about how learning about Marsha was so impactful for you. When you were doing this podcast this season, what are some lessons that you learned personally through your research and learning more about Marsha's life?
Well, it's interesting. One thing I knew, but like this has been another lesson in, is the importance of us preserving stories. And if it's not our own, of people that we love and care about, and a lot of the archival material we had access to was material captured on video by her roommate, Randy Wicker, who was an activist in his own right and actually was the first openly gay person to appear on television, essentially. And also, I think, on radio, to like tell his story on radio. And this was kind of like the era right before Marsha's era. But this whole process was just another lesson in the importance of safeguarding and protecting our stories, because we wouldn't have been able to tell as rich and as deep of a story without the work of people like Randy Wicker, Michael Casino, and even a lot of the archives we were able to lean on, like One Archives at USC libraries in California, and so many more. So we've got to do that work, especially in this time. I mean, one of the things that we know about fascism is that they come after narratives. So that's why we've been seeing these curricula bans and these book bans over the last few years increase. We've been seeing a deep connection between what happened in Nazi Germany, right, where they burned books that were all, and materials and research that was all about queerness and transness, produced by Magnus Hirschfeld and his Institute of Sexology. So that is an important lesson that I hope people can kind of take away, is that we've got to safeguard, defend, and protect our stories for posterity.
Right. I love that. I mean, that's definitely something we talk about on a constant basis when we talk about historical figures and calling them first, or calling them, giving the title, the first woman to do this or first Black woman to do this, and understanding that this is what we found. But because we do know how ugly white supremacy is and how they love to stamp out all of this history of marginalized people in general, and why it's so important that there are records and people are telling these stories. And it's such a beautiful thing when you do get to actually understand who paved this movement. I think about the fact that when you were talking about Marsha and you were giving bits and pieces of her interviews or her conversations with her friends, and she talked about how powerful the Black and brown trans gay community could be if they just came together, and how big of a movement they really could have. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, man, she really is defining intersectionality before that word even came out, in such a way that she's just simply saying we have this power because we understand the needs for the most marginalized. And it's like, boom, in episode 1, you already jump onto this conversation. And I just think about all of her work and advocacy with that kind of just general conversation she's just having with one person or a few people. But of course, looking back and like seeing all that progress she was saying, all that amazing statements, today, we're back with an administration that are actually trying to put so much setback in this progress. So I want to connect your studies and research and ask, what do you think Marsha's words would be, or thoughts would be, to her community as they continue with her activism, with this activism, with your activism today?
Yeah, well, I want to add another dynamic, because I actually think, when we're talking about Marsha, when she's talking about us coming together and understanding how our struggles are all bound together, she largely wasn't, just talking to Black and brown trans people. I mean, in that time, it really was Marsha and Sylvia talking to a lot of white cis gay people. and saying, hey, trans people have been here since the beginning. And, I think the unspoken thing is like actually trans folks, gender nonconforming folks, drag folks, or as they would say at the time, there were all these different categories of people considered queens, right? So street queens, scare queens, all of that. But also the sex workers, the people who were most at risk of being arrested, were the backbone of the movement and were the ones who were the most willing to try and hold power as we know it accountable. Like they were the first ones to really push back against the New York Police Department during the Stonewall riots. And I think that is still true today. We still have this kind of eternal queer struggle around, and not just in the queer community, but I think it's very pronounced in our community, between assimilation and kind of radical authenticity. Because there's this idea, well, if we just soften our edges, if we just silence ourselves, if we just kind of push away the folks who are considered the most disrespectable, then we'll get ahead. And that has never actually worked. It actually just gives permission for more discrimination down the way. And I think about that quote, right? It's like if they didn't come for you in the morning, they'll come for you at night or something like that. I think that that's true, and we have to remember that. And I think that that's at the heart of what Marsha was really trying to get people to understand, was that we're all on the chopping block, if anybody's on the chopping block, right? That kind of, in her own way, kingism, MLK, right? That kind of idea of injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. I think she and Sylvia were sounding that alarm in their own ways. And then I think the other piece from Marsha is that despite the struggles, you still deserve joy and beauty. And Tourmaline talks about this so deftly, that there's such a through line of pleasure in Marsha's life, even without all of the things that we often kind of associate with pleasure. Like, she still lived in abundance.
I love that. A lot of times when we have activists on here, like you, we talk about
you people.
We talk about things like burnout, or things like, not taking care of yourself, or feeling like you can't have that joy, or feeling like you can't take that space for yourself, and how that actually ultimately kind of takes you out of the whole thing, because your body is just like, oh, you can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
So as a leader in activism yourself, as someone who's been in activism for a while, what is some advice that you might have for up and coming activists who are fighting for liberation today?
Yeah. It's funny because I don't think that I'm always good. I think that it's cyclical for me. Like, I have periods where I'm better about my self-care, and periods where I'm just kind of in the thick of it and just like, we got to just keep going. And that's kind of the mode that I'm in right now. So I honestly don't feel like I'm in any position to advise anyone, but I do think it's important for us to prioritize our health as much as possible. When and if you can, eat well, and also understand that, like, your relationships have their own kind of meters of healthiness, right? So making sure that like you're able to show up for the people closest to you, and also ask of them to show up for you and figure out what those ways look like. I think rest is important. I think we have a backlash right now against rest. People are like, don't say rest is a radical act and revolutionary. And actually, there was this post by Imani Barbarin, amazing disability rights activist, who was saying, actually self-care and rest is radical, and this is why, and really was talking about the history of it, that it really kind of came from Audre Lorde and her cancer journals, where she was kind of talking about the importance of rest as self-preservation, so that you can keep going, so that you can keep fighting, so that you can keep living the full life that you deserve. And so what I take away from that is that, if you don't sit yourself down, your body is going to do it for you. So what are the ways that we can intervene before we get to that critical point? And then also, I think there's always a collective lesson as well, is that, if you want to have a commitment to your community and to others, you have to figure out how to preserve yourself so that you can continue to be in right relationship with everyone else, right? So there is like a duty of self-care to the collective, not just to you as an individual.
Yes, that's a great answer, because Samantha and I are both struggling with, our bodies basically told us to sit down.
It happens.
We have to let that sink in for a minute, because I'm one who want to push back a little bit. Like, I'm fine.
Yeah. It's so interesting. We have such an emphasis on how do we keep looking young, right? And, what would it mean for us to actually focus more on how do we keep feeling young and able to do the things that bring us joy for as long as possible?
Thanking our bodies for actually carrying us this far. We've had people tell us that. So, obviously, you just said you are in active mode. So we know you're a multitasker with lots of things that you're juggling. What are some things we can look forward to from you in the future outside of just this amazing, not just, obviously, including this podcast?
The shade. The podcast isn't enough. Give us more.
I'm just saying. I already know you got
you
stuff.
You should self-care, but what else are you doing?
I already know you got stuff, so give it to me.
Well, I am a co-founder of an organization, Gender Liberation Movement. So we are doing a lot of work right now around narrative power and direct action in this time. And funny enough, we're talking about healthcare and self-care and bodies. One of our biggest values is bodily autonomy. And so we've been doing a lot of work within that realm to get folks to understand the connection between the fight for reproductive justice and access to abortion and the fight for gender-affirming care, because we need a mass movement that understands that we all deserve bodily autonomy and for it to be protected and defended. So that's a lot of our work right now. We've also just working with affirming families, trying to shore up those safeguards as we await a ruling in the U.S. v. SMNTY case, which is at its heart a case about access to gender-affirming care for youth. So there are a lot of parents and a lot of guardians and other adults who really want to make sure that our youth continue to have access to the care that they deserve. And there are a lot of youth who want to keep fighting, honey. Trump does not scare them.
No.
You know, they're like, we know it's risky, but it is what it is. We want to be out here on the front lines. So we've been doing a lot of that work this year. So you can continue to learn more about GenderLib at genderlib.org, and also follow us on the socials. We're always updating folks. And still writing. You know, I have a few book ideas in the oven. So stay tuned about that.
See, I knew you had much more. Don't act like you weren't ready for that, because we know you constantly go. But with that, so the last time we kind of already mentioned this, and you already touched on quite a bit, and I'm really glad you said the word joy, because last time we asked you how you take care of yourself during all this chaos, and especially with your book tours. But I want to ask, how have you been able to protect your peace, and what is giving you joy right now?
Oh, protecting my peace has looked like not being at the whim of this whiplash-inducing news cycle. You know, I'm paying attention to the top line items and keeping it moving. I am not delving so deeply in it or letting it consume every waking moment. I think that's just important for all of us to remember as we continue to endure this era of Trump again. So that's a way I'm maintaining my peace. And then joy, I mean, I just had a birthday recently, so Gemini, and I got to see Beyonce on my birthday. So I went to Cowboy Carter, had my little cowboy hat, my sequined cowboy hat on, and a nice little like red fringe bodysuit. Yes. So I really had the best time. It was just really beautiful. And it's also Pride Month, right? So in between the protesting and the speaking and everything, I'm getting some partying.
Okay. You're doing some line dancing?
That's not my ministry, but I support.
Fair enough.
And you know, the only line dancing I'm doing is maybe at like my family reunion. You know, we do our electric slide. We'll do the wobble.
Okay. You haven't done the fan?
What's the
boots on the ground?
Oh, no. No.
The face you just made.
It's not for me. It's not me.
That's not your thing. All right, fair enough.
I would not look cute doing it, but I support. You got to know your limits. That's another way I'm protecting my peace, okay?
Not doing the fan.
You know what? Fair enough.
You don't want to see that.
I don't know. I kind of do now. Just kidding.
This kind of feels like if one day somebody is doing a podcast about you, Raquel, they'll be like, wouldn't do the fan.
You did not like the line dancing.
The line dancing, no way. But supported it.
I love a fan, though.
Yes.
So, you know, I'll do a fan, but not the fan.
Not the boots on the ground fan dance. All right, fair enough.
Oh, it's always such a delight having you here. Thank you so much for taking the time. We hope to keep the streak going and have you back again.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel it. It's going to happen.
Okay. I can't wait to hear about this new book, whatever it may be. No pressure.
Lord. Thanks. I mean, I've been doing a lot of freelance writing, so it's funny. The nuggets are out there. So, you know, I guess I'm doing like a Taylor Swift Easter egg kind of moment.
Let me go look into this.
Yeah, no.
I love these kinds of things. Well, thank you so much. Where can the good listeners find you?
Yeah, I mean, you can learn about my work at raquelwillis.com, our organization Gender Liberation Movement at genderlib.org. Afterlives has a website, afterlivespod.com, or you can just find it wherever you get your amazing podcasts. As a fellow label mate with iHeartMedia, I have to, urge you to use the iHeart podcast app, but, wherever you get podcasts.
Yes. And listeners, please go do that. Raquel, you're doing such amazing work, and we always love talking to you. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
If you would like to contact us, you can. Our email is hello@stuffInevertoldyou.com. You can find us on Blue Sky. I'm also a podcast. We're on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff I Never Told You. We're also on YouTube. We have a TeePublic store, and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks as always to our super producer, Christina, our executive producer, Maya, and our contributor, Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production by iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your favorite shows.